Last week, the US finally passed $61 billion in aid for Ukraine after months of debate and discussion in the US Congress. The news is a relief for Ukraine, as it's facing a difficult situation on the battlefield and a series of continued attacks by Russia. But is the aid coming too late? And is it really enough to help Ukraine get closer to achieving victory? To answer these questions, I'm joined today by Kristine Berzina, a managing director at the German Marshall Fund based in Washington, D.C. We're here to talk about the fact that the U.S. passed $61 billion in aid for Ukraine as part of its $95 billion foreign aid package. It's very welcome news, especially after such a long delay, such a long time worrying, a deteriorating situation on the battlefield for Ukraine. You know, it's not clear yet exactly what this aid package will mean for Ukraine on the battlefield, right? It's to be seen. Ukraine's ability to defend itself and to survive as a state is still very much those things are still very much in question. There are concerns about what a Trump presidency could look like for Ukraine, and what if there's a 6-month debate every time Ukraine aid comes up, right? And even, just yesterday, Politico reported that Biden administration officials aren't really sure that, this aid package or aid packages like it even are really enough for Ukraine to win. And all of this is leading to speculation about, okay, what actually can help Ukraine secure a win? Or, whatever the West gives Ukraine, is it enough to win or to just hold the line? So, in your view, how should we evaluate this latest package in light of the current situation? And how do you view it in terms of, what it will allow Ukraine to actually do? And is it enough?
I think it's a really welcome thing for there to be bipartisan support for Ukraine and for the package to go through. The package is not huge. And I think that is probably something of a disappointment. But again, given that there was a feeling that it might well be that there is no package before the election, it is absolutely essential aid for Ukraine not to significantly lose ground between now and the winter. So that, I think, makes Ukraine's ability to hold the territory it currently has and to have as much assistance in that process of staying still as it could have from the US right now. And because the Europeans are not capable of providing, again, a great deal before we get to the end of the year, this really has been essential. So in terms of expectations, we see the ability for Ukraine to, again, have more air defense systems in place, to have more ammunition, to have more of these long-range strike capabilities that have been so controversial for so long. But it isn't an infusion of, let's say, 200 billion or some unbelievable amount that is not on the table really from any side whatsoever, nor is the manpower available to really counter at a scale that would knock Russia out of Ukraine immediately. So that's the reality of the situation. There is a lot of aid in this package. There's 14 billion specifically for weapons for Ukraine moving forward. And there's a lot of support for the US in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. And there's some question about what is really the difference between the 14 million and the 60. What is entailed in that? There's economic and humanitarian assistance. Yes, there's anti-corruption follow through to make sure that the money is properly spent. But beefing up the American military, EUCOM, around what is going on in Ukraine, making sure that the U.S. backfills and increases production of what is essential, like 155s in the U.S. to be able to now or in the future send to Ukraine. This is part of it. So I think it's also a systemic reboot of the American military looking at how to respond to the Russian threat. So on the one hand, yes, it is being portrayed as a Ukraine aid package, and it is, but it's also an anti-Russian aggression package, which allows for the US and the US presence in Europe to become more capable. How much that matters on the front line, versus how much of that is a signal to Putin that this effort isn't going to go his way. That is a question. We can call that, we can try to split the difference and say, this is for the front line, this is for the broader allied effort, the US effort. Both things matter for Putin, but it's not as simple as the U.S. is saying sending 60 billion of weapons through the front lines immediately to turn the tide of the war and to allow Ukraine to have a second wave right now of a counteroffensive that would take back the territory that has been lost. That is not the situation we're in right now.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned this 200 billion in aid as a hypothetical figure, right? But I mean, it begs the question, like, why isn't it 200 billion? Why is it 61 billion? Why is it less than, like you said, it's kind of less than what we want or what Ukraine needs and what the US needs to, as you said, deter Russian aggression, in its own way as well. How could we get it to be more actually for Ukraine?
I think this is a very tough question. And I think the question is, well, who needs to put that money in the pot? The United States is in a moment of generalized reluctance to spend money on foreign priorities. To a significant extent, that is because it is an election year here. And there's a need for both parties and all candidates to show how they're delivering for US citizens in an election year. So very high numbers are not going to be especially politically possible. But apart from the campaign season, there's also a move across the US that is unsure about whether what happens in the world matters at home for the United States. And that is a tough sell, but also a story that is getting told better. Part of my job is to travel across the US with European officials, to sit down in diners, in pancake houses, in small university classrooms, with the state legislatures and explain how when these kind of aid packages go to Ukraine, it does create jobs and it creates important local resources in Middle America, in Iowa, for example. Iowa typically has considered its foreign role to be the export of corn and the export of soybeans, much more interested in Chinese foreign policy because of the soybean issue, rather than defense or world security affairs. But a major export from Iowa is also arms. And allowing Iowans to understand their role in NATO, in defense for Ukraine, is incredibly important. In Middle America, there isn't much of a sense that NATO is in Middle America. Sometimes it feels something over there. But instead, having the Americans understand that they do have a stake and actually a role, that from their hands in Middle America to the front lines, that is a very important thing. And so there's a lot of dots that need to be connected. The way that this package of aid is being framed and how clear it is that so much of it goes to the US. Again, on the one hand, could it just go directly, be framed as directly to the front lines? And I feel like that would be very satisfying emotionally, morally, for Ukrainians in particular. But for the ability to have future aid for Ukraine, to make sure to guarantee US support for NATO and for European allies in the long term, making that connection, making it clear that this isn't a suitcase of cash, which is something I get asked about. What are these suitcases of money being sent to Ukraine? But something that is tied to the American economy, to American manufacturing. And I think that gets at also American pride is very important. There's not much pride in suitcases of money being sent, but the pride comes from something that is created in the United States by Americans, in the cornfields building weapons, that is going to change the tide and show American strength and American resolve against aggressors. And that is a better story that I think will make it possible to have another aid package in the beginning of the next year. I don't think we should expect anything before then. Really, the campaign is going to be much too brutal to try to get another aid package through the Congress. But going into next year and congressional interest, I think you'll still have bipartisan support no matter what happens in the presidential side. And making sure that the constituents understand their role in all of this will be very, very important.
So I want to follow up with that. What has been the reaction to that sales pitch? I mean, I don't want to call it that to discredit it. It's a, it needs to happen. You have to sell policy. You have to communicate it to people, right? And how do Iowans or other people in Middle America react to this messaging around this bill, in your experience?
I think there's some surprise about it being so relevant for Iowa. Oftentimes arms manufacturing, it isn't especially sexy. They aren't giant billboards with arrows saying, look, what's happening right here. That's not the style of this sector. And so making broader society understand that they do have a stake has been really interesting.
So I want to shift a little bit. And, right now, things are good. The bill passed. There's momentum behind it. But there's still this looming debate over the overall objective goals and strategies surrounding the war. And you co-wrote an article in December of last year with Jackson Janes, where you guys talked about this, where in parallel to the debate over the aid itself, which was happening, there's this debate going on about okay, but how does this actually end? And that's led some to say we need to change our strategy. We need to redefine success for Ukraine. We need to actually maybe think of, the time has come, right, to make the parties sit down together and come up with some negotiated solution. And you and your co-author actually posed some questions in the article, and I'm just going to repose them to you here because they're really interesting, which is, why are so many policy experts in such a rush to press Ukraine to seek a ceasefire and retreat into defensive posture? And why are they, so interested in this idea that Ukraine needs to recalibrate its objectives and shift to a more defensive position? And so I want to hear your answers to those questions. I mean, why is there kind of a lot of proponents of this idea, of these ideas?
Well, I think there are many things going on. In the articles that we wrote, there's a call for strategic patience. And there are many parallels to the United States Revolution and to George Washington's aims to free the United States of British colonial rule. And in that time, this wasn't a war that the American Revolution that was able to be fought and won in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It was a long, drawn-out process. But nobody was holding a gun to George Washington's head saying, if you don't do it in a year, that's it. We're just going to go back to London and beg forgiveness, or leave half of the colonies to Britain and leave half of them for the United States. There was an ability to run the course and to fight a war to success. Is Ukraine being given that same amount of time, patience, support, durable support? That is a question. Why is there a rush? To a certain extent, the biggest wave of support for Ukraine came when there was the shock factor of the invasion, the underdog that didn't collapse. That was incredibly important. This was the moment of Ukrainian flags showing up everywhere across the United States. A lot of that has faded simply because of time and there being other concerns that are more front of mind. So a victory within that short period would have been especially satisfying. But that didn't happen. And so instead, what is the long game that Ukraine can play? What is the process and definition of its desires? Weapons are coming. And I think the importance of the package that was just passed is that it provides the stopgap. But the engine of defense production has really increased across Europe and the United States. Some ways, this summer that is coming up, I believe, is going to be the hardest moment. There are a few pieces of that. One of them is the lack of defense manufacturing being at the scale it has needed to be. Part of that was a hope for a quick victory, a disbelief that Ukraine could hold as long as it did, a sense that Russia would probably have to withdraw because why would anyone want a long war? All of those wrong reasons that didn't create the manufacturing that was necessary faster. But by the time we get into the end of this year and the beginning of next, we will be in a different situation. Arms are going to be much easier simply to have. There's the mobilization question. in Ukraine as well, where the ground is set for more mobilization without it having already been trained up in there. So in terms of a worst moment, I would imagine by the time we get to end of May through the summer, it's going to be really, really hard. So Ukraine needs to survive. Ukraine needs to keep Russia in eastern Ukraine and not getting into, especially central, keeping the south, keeping pressure on Crimea, not lose much ground so there can be a point of pushback. Russia appears strong. Russia appears well-resourced, but Russia is especially good at appearing to be all those things without necessarily being quite so whole on the inside. It's almost like one of those supermarket apples that has so much wax on the outside. It is red, it is glossy, it is shiny with wax, but the inside of it can be entirely rotten. It holds for a long time, but then once the inside needs to be what you're looking at, there might not be anything there, right? So I think that we need to push enough against Russia for the less whole insides to matter more. So this is why we're talking about this year as being hard and needing to get into the future years of this war. There are other reasons why many would like to simply wrap up the Ukraine question and move on. If you think about the Biden administration that came in almost for over 3 years ago now, the focus of many of the most senior officials was China. Asia was supposed to be the next thing that everyone thinks about. There were tasks that were important, such as pulling out of Afghanistan or simply saying that the quagmire of the Middle Eastern wars was something the US was not going to continue, was going to make a clean break and look at the important things that are coming next, which is Asia. And so if you look at the first year, the Afghanistan withdrawal, and then the AUKUS deal, so this is Australia and Europe and Summit for Democracies, the democratic world working together, but really in an orientation that faces the Pacific. That was not a world that the Biden administration was able to continue living in. The world decided that a European focus was going to be essential because Russia didn't want to be set aside. I mean, part of it is this continual push from Washington to want to put Russia in a box, put it on a shelf, make Russia happy with whatever it has so that Washington can think about something else. And in my experience, the only thing that Russia cannot stand is not being at the top of people's agendas, of being on a shelf in a box somewhere else. They will figure out how to cause trouble for any administration. And so there's a desire to wrap up the Ukraine question, to stop thinking about it, so that the bigger question, the more important question for many, of China could be front and center. Of course, China's watching very much what is happening in Ukraine. China is watching American policy towards Russia and Ukraine, and these things are by no means different. But there is a dissatisfaction with this among many in Washington. And the Europeanists now have had to play a far bigger role, but this is running counter to the deep desires for focus that many have here. But the reality is, Ukraine is going to need support, and Ukraine is going to keep on fighting also in the future. Some of that is Western aid dependent. Some of that depends upon Ukraine's own strategies, its ability to mobilize forces, to be motivated, to continue proving itself, all of that. But that is, again, a longer term game. That is something that's going to need support and an ability for political reasons or money reasons to say, never mind, we're going to look at a different region or just the US. That simply won't be possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. We think a lot about war fatigue and people want to just get it over with because they're tired of it. But this angle that actually they want to get it over with because they think that there's something more important that they have to address is a very interesting angle as well. It's like, no, just this is not how it was supposed to go. Like we had other plans. Yeah, and even when Biden got into when he became president, he sort of wanted to just fix things quickly with Europe. He extended, he sort of tried to repair relations with Germany and France after Trump had kind of stepped all over them. He allowed Nord Stream 2 to go through. So you can see that he kind of was like, okay, we're going to check some boxes off here. And then we'll, get to the other stuff, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, Russia doesn't like to be ignored, which is, I think, part of actually why it has these feelings towards Ukraine, even like Ukraine wants to forge a path in a different direction, and it can't stand that. It's like, no, that's out of the question. But I did want to ask about this fatigue, and there was something really interesting in the article that you wrote, which was that, it's really interesting that people can be fatigued by something that they're not fighting or doing. And so, I was thinking about it, and I'm like, okay, well, what do we mean what do we actually mean when we say that there's war fatigue? That, like, is fatigue actually the issue that people are having when they talk about, wanting to get this over with? And I think actually, you already answered the question a bit, which is that there's other priorities. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about this overall terminology of war fatigue, and how do you combat it also?
There's different kinds of fatigue. I think there is a bandwidth issue, which is why we get to second priorities. And for the Europeanists and everyone in this administration, it has been a marathon. I mean, there can be many criticisms made against this administration for its cautiousness or a sense of self-deterrence rather than greater ambition in terms of showing itself and showing a really tough line to Moscow. And yet, a lot of the frustration that people in administration have also had is they have wanted this aid package and others to go through much further ahead. And so the combined face of what America has been able to deliver is much less in terms of real arms than what the administration would have wanted because of Congress, which means there's just a lot of purely human exhaustion right now. It's getting to the end of this particular administration's first term. Maybe there will be a second term. We often see turnover also of key personnel because people are working insane hours, much as in Ukraine, day in and day out to try to get things done. So there is a human fatigue for those who are making the policies. There is a philosophical fatigue, perhaps, about how long we can only think about, or primarily think about Ukraine and think about Europe versus all the other problems going on in the world. Israel and Gaza right now, for example, is taking other attention. But there has been a fairly singular focus on Ukraine for a very long time. And then there's just, I think, a citizen base fatigue, which is, what does it mean for people to feel depressed about the state of the universe? And this, I think, is not necessarily war fatigue from people sitting in their armchairs watching CNN or Fox, which is a significant portion of the United States. It's not about being tired of Russia's onslaught or tired on behalf of the Ukrainians, but wanting the world to be a little bit better. And I think the way that there feels this constant, highly emotionally saturated nature of reporting, of absorbing the news, where everything feels that it is the end of the world. And in many ways, for Ukrainians, it is the end of the world. But maintaining that kind of emotional saturation on television in a 24-hour news cycle creates a sense of apathy or numbness, perhaps, on this. And so some of it is, well, how should we be talking about Ukraine? How do we tell the story? Perhaps when you look a few decades ago, there was simply an hour of news, both local and international and nightly news, that allowed for more concentration and nuance and then relaxation as well, as opposed to, again, this constant input of emotionally troubling material. So fatigue, war fatigue, news fatigue. Thinking in a campaign season, again, in the United States, that we're seeing much more of people simply choosing to disengage, right, from everything. That's not Ukraine's fault by any means, but I think it is a reflection of how much our societies are being asked to care without feeling like agency. So how do we get back to the question of, well, here's what can be done in a part of society across Europe, across the United States? Because again, otherwise it is simply emotionally troubling for a long time without a sense of conclusion or really an understanding of what agency any particular person might have in fixing this.
Now, this past, how do you expect that it will be framed going into the elections? How do you expect Biden to frame it? And how do you expect Trump to frame it? As you know, they sort of have to take different stances, right? And do you expect Trump to be as fully against Ukraine support as one of his pillars, one of his campaign pillars?
There's a lot of worry about how Trump is going to deal with the war in Ukraine, both in the campaign and afterwards. One thing that happened that was important in the last week is that Trump did not kill these votes. He did not call for the removal of Johnson. He technically has no right to, but he's incredibly influential in the ear of those on the far right of the party who are opposed to the aid, yet the aid came through. Part of that could be that there is such overwhelming support from both sides that it was politically unpopular for him and would probably have been a bad move to oppose really what is very clear majorities of both parties, both houses, for this aid support. So yes, there's that. Politically, is it a good decision? Is it a bad decision? He also maybe heard the message from President Duda, from David Cameron, from other people who have been talking about why this is important. So this is something that is a bit of a change in the way that he has seen Ukraine aid. If he were to be elected in the campaigns moving forward, there is a sense that he would like to wrap this up through a handshake ideally between him and Putin. Is that realistic? That I'm very skeptical about. And whose interests are going to be protected in that handshake? That is really, I think, the true worry that Ukrainians, but all of the eastern flank of NATO as well, should have as they look towards this campaign and if Trump were to be elected for a second term. A worst case scenario is a handshake saying, you may have what you currently occupy, B plus. We have no idea, really, what that conversation could be like of Ukraine without Ukrainian input, without President Zelensky's presence or any say whatsoever in that result. Trump could feel as though he could speak for everybody without having any mandate whatsoever and no any legitimacy to speak on behalf of Ukrainians, on behalf of President Zelensky, and on behalf of Europeans in this. There is no reason why Zelensky or the Ukrainians would have to go along with this, though we'd see a bigger fracture between Ukraine and the United States. We could see a fracture on this policy among NATO allies who would feel that this is a violation of their interests, a rewrite of Yalta. But if you look at why so many of the Eastern European diasporas were staunchly Republican throughout the Cold War and still are right now, it's because of a sense of betrayal by the Democrats in Yalta of exactly that kind of handshake. There is a past track record for the US to give a fatal handshake for the prospects of a couple of generations. No one in the Eastern Bloc is going to abide by that. They have seen exactly what happens when you fall on the wrong side of history. So it has tremendous implications for transatlantic unity, for European unity, for Ukraine altogether. That's a worst case scenario, really, of an unthought out compromise that could happen over the course of one meeting. Who is around Trump if he became elected would be incredibly important. Would those advisors understand those implications? Understand the economic interests, the security interests for causing massive fracture along the transatlantic space and in Ukraine, because Ukraine wouldn't necessarily stop fighting, right? So I think the potential for massive chaos is there. And instead, could there be cooler minds? Would there be a reality, a conviction from European allies to say, no, we're going to give Ukraine more of a shot? Can we have a stern conversation with all of our adversaries? Maybe there are different ways to massage this. Yes, but again, there are no guarantees. So I think there is a high level of unpredictability given a past Yalta situation where people know what they don't want, that is something to worry about. In the lead up to the election, I would imagine that Trump campaigns on, I'm going to get you out of all of these entanglements. The US has spent a lot of money, and my excellent negotiating power is going to get you out of all of these other entanglements. And we're going to deal with China, and we're going to deal with Russia and Iran in a matter of minutes. And therefore, you won't have to pay for or think about foreign policy. The reality is that does not work. There is no handshake that is going to meet all of that. So effectively, it is a false promise. But is it something that could sound convincing, be emotionally satisfying to an electorate? Potentially. Instead, what I think the Biden folks are going to do, and President Biden himself, is talk about how much has been achieved, the importance morally, for economically, for the United States to be that bastion, an example that otherwise is eroding, the distrust that Republican foot dragging has already created on the global stage, the wrong lessons that China has learned thus far. Those, I think, are going to be very important talking points. And especially what's important is that in these aid packages, the Republicans did not want southern border things to be included. So there's a sense of the Republicans not delivering whatsoever on some of these foreign priorities, including ones as important as the border. So instead, Biden is going to run on the success of what has happened so far, and very much a job not done, with the stakes being so high that putting this in the hands of Trump would be irresponsible for the future of the world.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting for our listeners and for myself to get a sense of how people talk about Ukraine now in spaces, different spaces in Washington and in the United States in general. I know you speak with people all over, so.
I think for the United States, Ukraine is still very deep in this fight. And the play-by-play gets far more attention than I think we should be giving it. Again, it leads to a sense of exhaustion as opposed to a sense of what is this bigger, more whole and strong West, for lack of a better term, look like? And how important is Ukraine for providing us the example of fighting, but of innovation, of resilience that we need all across our societies? There's this desire to go back to, I don't know, an idea of what the 90s were, right? And it wasn't necessarily that way in the Balkans or Rwanda or in other places, right? But a sense of sleepiness on the global stage. And yet that's not on offer. That's not what the adversaries aren't resting. There are people who don't like the way that the world developed after the Second World War. Certainly not after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they're not really eager to let it rest in that situation. And so having the tools to fight off the most aggressive, violent, shocking attack that we have seen after the Cold War is tremendously valuable. I think that this idea that Ukraine should come closer exists, but talking about the Ukrainian model in terms of even interoperability, Ukraine takes everything from everyone and makes it work. NATO has done a tremendous amount of hand-wringing over the past few decades of how do we use Soviet as well as Western technology? How do we use the systems and the missiles? You know, it can't possibly all work together. Will it work together? It absolutely does work together. Ukraine has to have it work together every single day. Ukrainians have figured out so many of the softer side of this conflict on messaging, on the human dimension. It is such a strong partner. I want there to be more of that conversation in the United States and Washington, and I don't hear it. Where I do hear it more is Brussels. Because of the acquis process, because of the prospect of EU membership, Brussels has had to already start imagining what a EU with Ukraine might look like. It has challenges, especially in the agricultural sector, but it has a lot of assets as well. So looking at what Ukraine has and how that grows the European pie is that, I think, ambitious imagination that Brussels is good at, because the integration will happen in the European continent first. It's still so much further from Washington and from the United States. And so I do have the conversations about, look what they're doing. Look at how they're figuring this out. This is the future. The US has been stuck thinking about a future that is China oriented, or in the military or defense industrial complex, thinking very much about, well, newer generations of weapons. Oh, we don't need 155s at all anymore. We're not going to dig trenches. What is it? You can have drones in electric warfare, and you can have lots of, you can need lasers, and you can need trenches, and you're going to need the 155s. And that has been a shocking reality, I think, for many defense planners as well. And so the US will come to this. The US will see these assets, but currently, in terms of who can imagine a Ukraine fully integrated, a Ukraine as an asset, Ukraine as a teacher to the rest of us, that is a European conversation that needs to become a transatlantic conversation. And eventually, I think the US will get it, just as the US as well.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to stop, to leave our listeners thinking about that European future with Ukraine in it, and this, and the transatlantic future in which Ukraine is a part of the whole story, and people having to sort of extend their imagination a little bit farther now. I think that's a good thing to reflect on. So thank you very much for your time. This was a great conversation. It was super interesting listening to your responses.